Dr. Charlie Bamforth joins me to discuss health, wellness, and beer. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 273. This is BeerSmith Podcast number 273, and it's early January 2023. Dr. Charlie Bamforth joins me this week to discuss health, wellness, and beer. Thank you to this week's sponsors, Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Every issue of Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine is packed with articles for homebrewers and beer lovers. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. And Blickman Engineering has been the pioneer of nano brewing, and they've helped hundreds of successful breweries achieve their dreams. Starting with one barrel systems in 2006 and now offering brew houses up to 15 barrels. They have cellaring equipment, keg washers, grain mills, and much more. Blickman Pro Brewing systems are competitively priced without sacrificing quality. When you're ready to go pro, be sure to reach out to them for expert advice. Email them now at proseries@blickmanengineering.com. Again, that's proseries@blickmanengineering.com. And I recently updated the payment system for BeerSmith to give you more options to check out or purchase and renew our BeerSmith desktop and web-based software. You can now purchase 2- and 3-year licenses at a discount, and you can use Venmo and Square for non-subscription payments. I'll also be announcing a BeerSmith 2 to 3 upgrade program shortly to make it easier than ever to upgrade. Check out BeerSmith Brewing software now at beersmith.com. And now let's jump into this week's episode. Today on the show, my guest is Charlie Bamforth, Professor Emeritus of Malting and Brewing Science at the University of California at Davis. Charlie specializes in the study of wholesomeness of beer, including beer perception, polyphenols, foam stability, oxidation, and flavor stability. And of course, today we're going to talk a little bit about health. How are you, Charlie?
Well, talking of health, I'm very well, thank you. That's what beer drinking can do for you. I'm hale and hearty. I'm very well.
You're doing good. And what have you been up to since in the last year? It's been almost a year since I had you on last.
Yeah, well, more of the same, really. I still very active with Sierra Nevada Brewing Company. I'm the senior quality advisor. I'm just starting my 5th year doing that.
Wow.
And since I retired from UC Davis, of course. And then I'm still involved with the university, still doing the sort of continuing and professional education. And we've got the classroom back open again now, doing the Master Brewer Certificate in the classroom, but also online as well. So we've been busy putting that together. And some of my previous courses progressively going on to Coursera. So a series of courses I did on quality, they're progressively going to go on to Coursera. And so the foam one is already there. So
what's Coursera? I'm sorry.
Coursera is the sort of the global sort of education medium online.
Oh, nice.
And you can basically, as far as I'm aware, you can listen to the talks and the presentations for no charge at all. But if you want to get a certificate and you want to have it listed as something you've done in your training, then the money has to change hands.
Of course.
So any of your listeners who don't want a certificate but want to listen about bubbles, then they can go to Coursera and do that right now.
Nice. Yeah, I'll put a link for that in the show notes. That sounds like an interesting thing.
Great.
And I think you mentioned, we were talking before the show, you said you've been working probably just as hard now as before your retirement.
Yeah, my wife is periodically, she sort of says to me, you are retired? Are you retired? So we do try to set aside one day each week where I don't do things, but I'm still busy writing. The book I did many years ago called Scientific Principles of Malting and Brewing, that is about, the second edition is about to be released. That's from the American Society of Brewing Chemists. And that I've done with my successor at UC Davis, Glenn Fox. So we've done that together. And the 4th edition of the very first book I wrote on beer, Tap into the Art and Science of Brewing, that 4th edition, I just submitted the material to Oxford University Press for that. So, still busy.
Awesome. Well, we look forward to the books. And today you wanted to discuss health and well-being as it relates to beer. Many of us don't really associate beer consumption with a healthy lifestyle, but your research that you sent me does note that beer does have some benefits in moderation, right?
It certainly does. One of my former colleagues in the Department of Nutrition at UC Davis used to refer to beer as empty calories, and that is simply not true. There are calories there, of course, but there's a lot of nutritional value in beer. And beer has been discussed in relation to various health issues, both positive and negative, for a long time now. Mm-hmm. The problem is it's very hard, certainly for somebody who has been part of the brewing industry since 1978, to stand up and say, hey, beer's good for you, because people are going to say, oh yeah, hell yeah, oh yeah. and who? So it's very hard to do that. And not only that, in this day and age, it's not permissible to market a product proactively for a brewer to proactively sell beer on the basis of a health issue. Back when I was a young lad and growing into pub culture, people like Guinness used to market their beer on, literally the slogan was, Guinness is good for you. And I remember a beer called Mackerson Sweet Stout. And that was advertised on the TV by a famous Shakespearean actor called Sir Bernard Miles. And he used to sit, showed him sitting there as a little old man in a corner of a bar somewhere saying, it looks good, it tastes good, and by golly, it does you good. Can't do that these days. It's not possible. So it's very difficult. It's a very fine line you've got to walk. I've not been afraid of walking it over the years, and certainly at the university did a lot of work in this area, pointing out as dispassionately as possible the positives and the negatives. But the problem is, it's like a guy many, many years ago who advised the British government on alcohol and health. And he basically said, it's an unforgiving subject because people are partisan on either one side or the other. And it doesn't matter what anybody says or does, you're not going to sway people's prejudices. Yeah. So those people who are anti-alcohol, including beer, no matter how good the evidence is that in moderation alcohol is good for you, they're just not going to accept it. And equally, there are those people who just don't want to listen. If you say, hey, you can go too far, and you shouldn't abuse alcohol any more than you should abuse anything else. So it's a tough area, and I can tell you that there, back in my days at University of California, Davis, there were some very big brewing companies who basically said, Charlie, just shut up, and don't go this way, because you're not going to convince the naysayers. And if anything, people are going to say, well, you're using brewing money to promote beer as a healthy beverage. And of course, I never did do that. I never used any funds from the brewing industry to spread messages of responsibility and benefit in moderation. So that's quite a lengthy spiel there, Brad. I'm sorry about that, but it's a tough road to hoe.
No, it's good. And I think, making the topic even more complex is the fact that, you don't live by beer alone. So it's hard to agree on, what a safe level of beer drinking is, or perhaps even what the effects might be if you have just one or two beers here and there,
Yeah, just 2 days ago, the New York Times front page storyline about, there's alcohol's not good for you, full stop, And it puts me in mind of, which I don't agree with, by the way. Mm-hmm. It puts me in mind of a paper that was published in, I think it was The Lancet, 3 or 4 years ago. And this a huge group of people. I mean, I think the author list spread to over a page globally. Basically said there is no safe level of drinking. And basically what they were saying is the guideline should be don't drink. Mm-hmm. And luckily there's a guy at an ethical department at the University of Cambridge in England who took issue with this. This is Sir David Spiegelhalter. And he looked at the data that was being presented and he said, if you look at it and you analyze the data, what they're basically, I can't remember what exactly the details was, but it was something like, if 10,000 people all drink a bottle of gin, one of them will develop a problem. It's putting things in context. And what he said was, it's safer to have basically have a glass of alcohol than it is to eat a bacon sandwich, and certainly safer than going into a motor car or on a bike. And he said, there's really no safe level of living, but nobody would recommend against it, So it's easy to sound kind of cynical and trite about it. I'm not trying to do that, but it's all, there's a risk associated with everything, and people need, instead of just presenting this stuff, they need to qualify and explain exactly what the data is showing. But as you say, in life, you don't only drink beer or drink wine or drink whiskey. You do all sorts of other things as well, including foodstuffs. So drawing correlations, whether you're trying to draw a correlation or coming up with a claim that something's bad for you, like beer is bad for you, or indeed beer is good for you, you're actually basically asking people questions about how much they drink, and you're basing all your conclusions on what they tell you, mm-hmm. and drawing correlations between, they say they drink this amount of beer, for example, and then you with as many people as you can, but the population is usually not analyzed as large as it should be. You're trying to draw correlations with the extent to which they might develop a certain illness. But what else do they do? Do they smoke cigarettes? Do they eat bad food? Unhealthy food? It's complicated. So there are two issues here, Brad. The first is, how do they generate that x-axis, if you like? So they've got a graph between a certain type of illness, incidence of a certain type of illness, and how much beer you drink. The way they've generated how much beer you drink is they've asked you questions. So you go to your doctor, and the doctor says, "Do you drink?" And you say, "Yeah, I enjoy a beer." "Well, how much do you have?" "Oh, I just have a pint a day." "You liar. I mean, it's probably 2 pints, and let's not forget the glass of whiskey and the bottle of wine that's thrown in for good measure during the week. So there's, people don't tell the truth about exactly. So there's real doubt about that x-axis, the amount people consume. But not only that, it's all the other things they do. There was a study a number of years ago in Copenhagen, and what they did was they all these young students, they put them outside supermarkets, and when people emerged from the supermarket, they asked them if they could have the printout of what they've been buying. And they divided these printouts into those people who've been buying wine and those people who've been buying beer. And people who've been buying wine have been buying bottled water and lettuce and, low-fat spreads and that sort of thing. People who've been buying beer were buying red meat and burgers and potatoes and sausages and, so they, on the one hand, you've got this, wine is healthier. Well, inherently, I don't think so, because there's more nutritional value in beer. But also, there are all these vagaries about how accurate the data is, what are the interfering factors, and so on. So if you look at these correlations, there's data everywhere. The scatter is immense, and that applies either way. Whether it's something, hey, beer is bad for this or beer is good for this. There's always going to be, a degree of doubt about it.
Right, right. Well, why don't we dive into the science a little bit? Why don't we start with calories? And I think you noted that most of the calories come from alcohol itself, right? So obviously you're consuming calories here.
Yeah, absolutely. Basically, the more alcohol in your beer, the more calories are in that beer. And that's why if you really want a low calorie beer, then it's got to be a low alcohol beer. I remember a few years ago, I was asked to contribute to a discussion paper about the sort of the English cask conditioned ales. And of course, in England, the beer on tap you're likely to get in a pub, it will often be about something like 3.5, 3.7, 3.8% ABV.
Mm-hmm.
And that's got considerably less calories in it than a 5% ABV. Product. A lot of people get confused, and I make no apologies for using brand names, but there's more calories in a Bud than there is in a Guinness, the same volume. So people get confused. If you ask most people, people who don't really understand about beer, and you said, "Hey, which do you think has got more calories in it, a Guinness or a Budweiser?" I'm pretty sure 99% of people would say the Budweiser.
Yeah.
But it's actually the Guinness that's got lower calorie count because it's primarily driven by the alcohol. So yeah. There is some carbohydrate in beer, obviously, and most beers, about 20% of the starch is left behind as dextrins. So there is carbohydrate, but and of course the protein makes a contribution as well. But by far and away, the greatest calorie count is due to the alcohol. So the higher the alcohol of your beer, the more calories.
And of course, you just mentioned carbohydrates, and that's a major component as well. And of course, we've all been urged to, consume less carbohydrates, leading to, the low carb beers that I think came out in the 90s and so on.
Well, there's an interesting story there, Brad, that I remember an old great friend of mine, a technical director for a very famous brewing company, said, "Charlie, have you ever read the South Beach Diet?" And I said, "No." He said, "You need to read more." So he said, if you read the South Beach Diet, it says the worst thing you can put into your body is beer, because beer contains the sugar maltose, and that is the worst sugar for leading to a buildup of carbohydrate in the system. And so you must avoid beer. So I was urged on behalf of the industry to write to the founder of the South Beach Diet. And I said, interesting, have you ever heard of the interesting phenomenon known as fermentation? And in this process, most of the maltose, and usually pretty much all of the maltose, is converted into alcohol. Sure, alcohol is a significant source of calories, the main source of calories, but it is not maltose. And they changed it online, and they said, due to recent research, we can rescind the ban on beer. Bizarre. So the carbohydrates you're going to have in beer, the main ones are the dextrins, the unbroken down parts of the starch. And they are metabolized by the body, but they're metabolized slowly and gradually. So they release the carbohydrate gradually. And, if you talk to sports scientists and the like, they talk about slow release carbohydrates, and slow release carbohydrates.
I'm thinking like whole grains here, or something like whole grain bread, for example.
Yeah. So they're slow release carbohydrates. And so they gradually contribute the fermentable sugars or assimilable sugars in the body, not fermentable, the assimilable sugars in the body, but they do it gradually. So if anything, the main carbohydrates left behind in beer are good carbohydrates. Now that's the so-called alpha glucans. You've also got the beta glucans, which of course, use the term beta glucan or pentosans as well, the other type of molecules in the cell walls of barley. And brewers start saying, oh, those are terrible things because they slow down the brewing process and so on. Well, yeah, but good news from the point of view of health. So during malting and brewing, most of the beta glucan, and we did a huge amount of this over the years in my labs, most of the beta glucan is broken down, not all the way to glucose. It only goes as far as small sugars, which have got 2 or 3 glucoses linked together. Mm-hmm. And these are not fermented by the yeast. They survive into the beer. They're called oligosaccharides. And not only that, they go into the body and they don't get taken away. They go all the way through to the southern end of your digestive system. And there we have shown that they actually support the growth of beneficial bacteria. They're so-called prebiotics.
Probiotics.
So the beta-glucan breakdown products are prebiotics. Now, the pentosands, which is the other component of the cell wall, those are not well broken down at all in malting and brewing. And they, therefore, pro rata, there's a lot of these so-called pentosands or arabinoxylans present in beer, and they constitute soluble fiber. So, a pint of beer is a not insignificant, in other words, it is a significant source of soluble fiber. So there's good carbs. There's good carbs in beer.
So after hearing all that, do we really need low carb beer? I mean,
well, well, that's the interesting thing, the company that urged me to contact the South Beach diet guy. While I was doing it, they came out with a beer, and I'm going to name. I've got to name names. Michelob Ultra, and they labeled it low carb beer. And I said, why have you done that? Why have you done that? Because if you say something is low carb, then by inference, everything else you do must be high carb.
Yeah.
I mean, so I don't like this low carb, high carb. I mean, I think it's good carb is what we need to be talking about. So, but the thing is, when you've got a low carb beer or a low calorie beer, or the diet beers, the Bud Miller Coors Lights of this world, then they've got fewer calories because they're more fully fermented, and to make sure they don't have as many calories, you bring the alcohol down to lower than you have for the equivalent comparable beer. So a Bud is 5% ABV. So a Bud Light is somewhere around 4.3 from memory. So that's why it's a low calorie product. Mm-hmm. And it's going to have lower carbs than the equivalent, the Budweiser in this case, but it's going to have more carbs than the low carb product. So the low carb product is very low in carbohydrates. So you're not putting any dextrin in there, whether it's good or not, and it is slow release carbohydrate, but you're just not adding that extra carb. So the net calorie content is less in a low carb beer.
Interesting. Well, I mean, beer also contains some proteins, right? And those can be beneficial in some ways, but also it can be a problem for people with certain sensitivities. Yeah,
I mean, there's probably no beer is going to have it's not going to satisfy your daily requirement for protein. Let's put it that way. It's much more important for the bubbles. But, there are people who are sensitive to some of the proteins, particularly the storage proteins and their breakdown products that come from the grain. And so these are people who are basically, the term that's usually used is gluten intolerant. And diseases like celiac disease and so on. So sure, there are people who are sensitive to those materials. Now, this whole area is a little bit challenging because there's a lot of discussion, a lot of debate about the methods that are used to measure these protein materials in beer. So there is basically an immunological method, which we've got a lot of experience with. But there's a group in Australia that insists you've really got to use much more sophisticated mass spectrometry to actually really ensure that you've got none of these things left behind. But using the immunological method, which in my opinion tells you 90% of the story, if not more, we find that I mean, regular beers, most regular beers, they don't contain anywhere near as much of this problematic material, protein, as people suspect. And the reason is that the whole malting and brewing processes are an exercise in getting rid of protein. So there's extensive breakdown of protein during malting, during germination. There's a heck of a lot of protein precipitated out and lost during mashing, even more than is lost during boiling, but more is lost during boiling. You get it lost in the fermenter. You get more protein removed during cold storage, and so on. So the amount of protein that's left behind is much less than was put into the system. But nonetheless, there will be people who are, sensitive to those lower levels. So yeah, there are now gluten-free beers, but to be gluten-free, it has got to be made from a material that does not contain these types of proteins. So if you, in this country, in the United States, if you are producing a beer from barley or wheat or rye or oats, then you can't ever call it gluten-free.
Yeah, I found that quite interesting. The TTB, for whatever reason, defines gluten-free different than the food industry. So, yeah, I can't remember the exact number, but it's like 0.02% or something. I don't know exactly, but whatever the level is, and you can call it gluten-free food. But if you had a beer that was the same, it wouldn't be gluten-free.
No, it's easy to feel victimized, Brad. But all I know is that if you've used fairly traditional sort of grist materials like barley and wheat, you can never, irrespective of whether you prove that you can't detect anything, you cannot call it gluten-free. You can say things like processed to lower gluten or gluten reduced or something like that.
Yeah.
And that's why there are beers made out of sorghum and buckwheat and so on, and those can be referred to as gluten-free.
Right.
The alternative way of doing it is to actually add an enzyme in the fermenter, and this is an enzyme that removes the problematic peptides and proteins. But then those beers are not able to be labeled as gluten-free. But analytically, well, we can't find any of these problematic materials in there. Great examples would be Omission from Bridgeport and Sufferfest, which we at UC Davis helped Caitlin Looney develop originally.
Yeah, you can do it at the homebrew level too. I think White Lab sells a product. I think it's called Clarity Firm, and they have a different name for the professional version. But you can add it, and it does cut out almost all the gluten in a regular beer. So,
well, in our experience, it cuts it all out. But as I say, that's using this immunological detection system, and the TTB, they just won't accept it.
Yeah.
No matter how good the data is, they're not going to accept it.
Well, beer also contains phenolics and phenols, so I thought you might want to talk about those.
It does. Of course, the phenols are particularly championed by the red wine lobby, saying that they've got things like resveratrol in there, and that's cuts down the risk of atherosclerosis and so on. To get enough resveratrol from red wine, you've got to have bottle after bottle after bottle every day. But there are phenolics, and of course they are antioxidants. It's the whole, not only in the beverage industry, alcoholic beverage industry, but food generally. Of course, people talk a lot about antioxidants and saying, this food is rich in antioxidants, that food is rich in antioxidants. They talk about red wine, they talk about green tea, and beer as well. The way in which they measure the antioxidants is basically in a test tube. So there's a standard method for measuring antioxidant potential in a test tube, and that's how they compare different materials. We have shown, DiPietro and I showed that, you get different results depending on which method you use. And you can get different rankings, different antioxidants, depending on how you measure them. And the real thing that matters is, does the antioxidant get into the body? And when it does it actually do a job when it gets into the body? And the brutal reality is, for most of the foodstuffs, there is not very clear evidence about whether these highly claimed levels of antioxidants actually do any good, because we don't know if they do or do not get into the body. The one material that there is good evidence for that it gets into the body is from beer, and that's something called ferulic acid. Now, ferulic acid is, again, it's associated with the cell wall. It's attached to the arabinose islands, pentosands in the cell wall, and it's released during mashing under the right conditions. Now, some of your listeners may be familiar with it. It's the material that is converted into the clovey flavor in Hefeweizen by heifer yeast. But the ferulic acid, before that conversion, is an antioxidant. And there were studies at Guy's Hospital which showed that it actually gets into the body more efficiently from beer than from a tomato.
Interesting.
Which also contains ferulic acid. So there is good evidence that this fairly small molecule is nimble and able to get into the body and get to the parts that matter. So, that same evidence doesn't exist for some of the bigger, more complex polyphenols that you have in, say, red wine. So, yeah, phenolic acid and phenols generally, people have link them through to all sorts of influences on the body. But the things that matter is how much is present. And we know that ferulic acid is a significant component of beer, particularly dependent on mashing conditions. But also we know that it does get into the body. So, if there's one thing that I think, one phenolic material, which I think is of major interest to brewers, it is that one.
So how does this relate to dark beer, for example? Is a really dark beer like a Guinness going to be better for you than a light lager or something like that?
It's a very good question. And of course, Guinness, they get very sensitive if you try to talk these days about Guinness and health, but there's certainly a global acceptance that Guinness is good for you and is probably more full of beneficial materials than other things. What I would say is this, Brad. Yeah, there's going to be more of the complex polysaccharides, the beta-glucan breakdown products, and the pentosan are going to be present in larger quantities in a Guinness than they would in, say, a North American light beer. We at the university, UC Davis, we actually looked at the level of the B vitamin folic acid because beer contains significant levels of all of the B vitamins except thiamine, except vitamin B1. But folic acid is the one that is particularly talked about. And to cut a long story short, we found that the highest levels were in Guinness. Which delighted my co-author because he's from Ireland. So the bottom line is that if you've got a material product like Guinness, which has got lots of grain in there, then obviously it's going to have a lot of these beneficial materials. But you get beneficial materials that are coming from hops, and the yeast itself. Yeast initially needs some vitamins in the wort to actually get going, but yeast itself is a source of vitamins. That's why you can go to your health food store and buy dried brewer's yeast as a source of vitamins and so on. So, beer is a significant source of B vitamins, and at least one other famous adult beverage that comes in the red and white form and pink is not.
Well, you mentioned beer does contain some useful vitamins. It also contains probiotics, and I believe, at least I've heard that fresh beer is in many ways better for you than the pasteurized, processed, filtered kind.
I don't think that of itself is a major issue, but I think what you're referring to is the yeast itself.
Yeah.
And there is evidence that there may be a probiotic impact from yeast itself. Um, what I referred to earlier on was these breakdown products from the beta glucans. They are prebiotics. In other words, they support the growth of organisms in the large intestine. I personally have no experience, and I've not dug into probiotics in relation to beer. In other words, and some of your listeners may sort of have come across foodstuffs that are, yogurts and so on, and they claim to have all these beneficial bacteria in there. Well, those bacteria have got to survive the journey through the digestive system. So I personally have I've not dug deeply into probiotics in relation to beer and health. I can speak with absolute confidence about prebiotics, these oligosaccharides. Yeah, these claims are being made. But beer also contains other beneficial materials. It contains a bunch of minerals, of course. And probably the most significant thing about beer is that it's a very rich source of silicate. Now, this comes from the husk of barley, so there's a lot more silicate in a barley-based beer than, say, a wheat beer. And when you're in the brew house, and particularly the more aggressive you are in mashing and in lautering and with the rakes and all those things, you are sweeping silicate off the husk. And this leads to very significant levels of silicate in the beer. And it has been shown that modest consumption of beer does protect against osteoporosis. It's good for bone health in moderation. So that again, that's one of those correlations that I was talking about earlier on that it's difficult to draw. But all I can say with absolute confidence is that beer is a hugely rich source of silicate. I believe bananas are quite significant. Also, granola, muesli, the breakfast food. Mm-hmm. That's rich in silicate. But personally, I'd prefer to get my silicate from a pint of beer.
Probably so. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, let's talk for a minute about melanoidins. We just did a episode on the Maillard reaction, actually, and talked quite a bit about it. But can you talk a little bit about melanoidins? And I think they have some antioxidant properties as well.
Yeah, they're believed also to contribute to the antioxidant character. So obviously there's going to be more of these present if people are using specialty malts. But there, of course, we're talking about the sort of the caramel malts and the crystal malts. When you're talking about the roast grains and the sorts of things that you get the color from in Guinness, then of course that's a different chemistry altogether. That's pyrolysis. But melanoidins, yeah. So again, they would form part of that fraction of materials that are claimed to be antioxidant materials and protect against radical damage. So it's I think fairly well established now that activated oxygen, things like superoxides and hydroxyl radicals, they're not only bad for beer flavor stability, but they're also bad for the body. And therefore, again, if there are materials which are antioxidants, but only if they actually get into the body, then anything that's an antioxidant that is assimilable and taken up into and reach the parts of the body where it matters, then yeah, you can point to it. So I would say, to the best of my knowledge, there is no downside to melanoidins. There is a potential benefit to them. Now there are some other molecules, not melanoidins, in beer that have been shown to be to protect against tumor formation in model systems. So I've segued a little bit now, but I didn't want to forget to mention this. So there are materials, including some things that come from hops, like the xanthohumols and the isoxanthohumols, that have been claimed in model systems, in laboratories, to protect against tumor formation in model systems.
Hmm.
Now, one's got to be very, very careful.
Yeah.
And anybody who claims, hey, beer contains anti-cancer materials, that would be a
Probably a
huge
stretch.
step. It's too far. But there are materials, so there are antioxidants which protect against radicals, and radical and reactive oxygen species. They cause problems for the body. But also there are some other materials which in theory at least might have a beneficial contribution to make. I'm sure you're sensing that I'm being extremely cautious
Yeah.
with the way I'm talking. So it's very easy to actually say there's all these good things in beer, and there are a lot of good things in beer. What is not so easy to say is that they categorically get into the body and do good,
Mm-hmm.
or indeed do harm.
Yeah. Well, mild to moderate consumption has been tied, at least in the paper you sent me, to reduce risk for some conditions that have some benefits, and that things includes things like the heart, hypertension, and so on. Can you talk a little bit about those?
Yeah, again, this is an area that there's medics that are on both sides of the fence. Some firmly convinced that
Correlation's not causation, right?
correct. So there are those that are totally convinced that there is a merit in moderation. There are those that are no. The guideline should be avoid alcohol, and there are those who are saying it's probably just one more thing. Don't abuse it, but as long as you're sensible doing what you're doing, then just enjoy it in moderation. Those who have, there have been many studies over the years for not only wine drinkers but also beer drinkers that have drawn up what they call the U-shaped and the J-shaped curves. So if you imagine a graph with two axes, then if you go on the y-axis, the vertical axis, you've got the risk of death, and on the x-axis you've got units of alcohol, amount of alcohol you consume. Then for all causes of mortality, all causes of death, there is this so-called J-shaped curve. So that if you don't drink, you've got a certain risk of death. If you drink, say, 1 or 2 beers a day, regular strength beers, whatever that means, then that lowers the risk of death. But then if you drink more, then the risk goes up again. Remember everything I've said earlier on about drawing correlations and so on. But that is the way in which this J-shaped curve is presented. The U-shaped curve is basically the same, but there's now a big valley. In other words, if you don't drink, you got a certain risk of death. If you drink 1 pint, you got, say, 30% less risk. 2 pints, also 30%. 3 pints, also 30%. 4 pints, 30%. And then it starts to go up again. So it's like a U-shaped valley.
Sure.
And that's the correlation for atherosclerosis, coronary heart disease. So in other words, the claim is that moderate consumption, but that can cover a wide range, simply cuts down that risk of atherosclerosis. And the argument is that it cuts down the level of the bad cholesterol accumulating in your arteries. Again, I stress there are some people who are challenging that, but there's a lot of medics over the years that have insisted that it's a reality. And whether it's and the probably the best, the most famous of these medics who really was an extremely responsible researcher was Arthur Klatsky from Kaiser Permanente, and he basically said, it's any beverage, it's any beverage, and the fingers mostly are pointed at ethanol as being the active ingredient, not this resveratrol in wine, but the alcohol itself. But there are other things as well. In the same way, there is supposed to be this J-shaped or U-shaped correlation with late onset diabetes, and the risk of incurring late development of diabetes is reduced by moderate alcohol consumption. Cuts down the risk of ulcers, stomach ulceration, because the alcohol kills off the organism, the bacterium Helicobacter pylori in the stomach, which causes ulceration. There's correlations with improved cognitive function in the elderly, which I'm delighted about. And the list goes on. Reduced risk of kidney stones, reduced risk of gallstones. When it comes to things like cancer, there are many publications, and those are the ones that usually get reported in the newspapers, correlating alcohol, but also other things with various types of cancer. But you can go to the literature and you can find papers which have drawn the opposite conclusion. Again, it comes back to what population of people did they use? What are the confounding factors, and so much else besides. So I think what I always say to people, and I'm not a medical doctor, but what I say to people is, you've really got to understand the relative risk of anything that you do. And I'd be the first person, on campus to caution the students against doing stupid things. Don't play beer pong; it's stupid. But don't listen to people who say it's empty calories. It's not empty calories. So these are the facts. These are the facts about beer. But think of the other things that people enjoy in life. They enjoy cured meats. Some of the ways in which meats are cured are using carcinogens, But back in the most famous food safety risk that the brewing industry faced was in the late 70s from something called nitrosamines. And some analytical chemists in Canada found that when you kiln malt, you produce nitrosamines. And these are carcinogenic, or at least to rats. In the model system, they're carcinogenic. So there were significant levels in the malt and getting into the beer. Well, the malting and the brewing industry responded to this instantly. I mean, when I say instantly, within a year. And what they found was that if you don't dry the malt directly, in other words, let me backtrack. The nitrosamines are made by a precursor in the embryo of the grain reacting with oxides of nitrogen in the atmosphere.
Right.
So NOx in the atmosphere. So if you kiln, but you do it indirectly, so you don't expose the malt to the ambient atmosphere, then you don't produce nitrosamines. And so nitrosamines is not an issue anymore, at least that source of nitrosamines. And I say to people, when you're having your barbecue next,
exactly,
the beer is the healthier component there. So I love my barbecue, and I love my bacon sandwiches, and I love all these things.
Yeah, they said bacon's like a pack of cigarettes or something like that. But,
and it's
and you probably drive a car too.
I do, and luckily I drive it more slowly than I used to.
One of the most dangerous things we do each day probably is drive the car.
Yeah, crossing the street, So you've got to make a value judgment about what is the relative risk of this. So I remember when I was talking about the silica and the bone strength. I remember I was interviewed by over the telephone from, I think it was Colombia, somebody in Colombia, South America, and they said, "Oh, it's great news about bone health. Does that mean we can have everything on a Saturday night, and I get our daily, our weekly, our daily intake just in one go on a Saturday night?" I said, "No, because you're going to fall over and break your leg, and that's not good for bone strength." But so moderation, sensible drinking.
I apologize, Charlie, but we are running out of time. I just wanted to do maybe a minute or two on some of the risks of perhaps drinking too much.
Well, if you really abuse alcohol, then you are gonna get fatty deposits in the liver, and ultimately, if you drink copious quantities daily for year after year after year, you are going to get cirrhosis of the liver. But that is, you've got to be a serious drinker for a very long time to do that. But yeah, basically, the more alcohol you drink, whether it's beer or anything else, the more you're going to get fatty deposits in the liver, and that is a risk. Yeah, there's degradation products of nucleic acid, so you increase your risk of gout. Um, but so again, it's a balance between the positives and the negatives. But I think one of the main positives is that a beer or two calms you down, and I'm sure that there's not a direct link, but a relaxing influence, which is one of the reasons I'm sure why people talk about it improving life, particularly like me, as you creep on in years.
Well, Charlie, I wanted to get your closing thoughts, and I do apologize. We're just flat out running out of time here, but I appreciate you coming on. What are your closing thoughts on the net gain or net health loss for moderate drinkers?
I'm nothing I've heard or read has turned me away from being a beer lover. I would argue that beer is the healthiest of the adult beverages, because for the simple reason that it has got more nutritional value than anything else. It's a lot more beneficial nutritionally than is wine. And nothing I have said in terms of the risks, nothing I have seen or heard would suggest that anything other than the fact that my beer or two each day is a good way to go. And I also stress the fact that one thing we've not talked about is, if you drink alcohol to excess, do not operate a machine of any type.
Obviously, yeah. I mean, one of the big risks, obviously, of drinking too much is just doing something stupid,
Yeah, totally.
Yeah. Well, Charlie, thank you so much for coming on the show. Really appreciate you being here, and hope to have you on again soon.
I hope so. Don't get tired of me.
Never. I think I mentioned you're one of my favorite guests, so.
You say that to everybody.
Yeah. No, I don't, actually. But today my guest was Dr. Charlie Bamforth, Professor Emeritus of Malting and Brewing Science at the University of California, Davis. And Charlie, thank you once again for coming on the show.
Absolute pleasure.
A big thank you to Charlie Bamforth for joining me this week. Thanks also to Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. They offer access to videos, brewing courses, exclusive articles, and the amazing Craft Beer and Brewing Magazine. Go to beerandbrewing.com to get your subscription today. Again, that's beerandbrewing.com. And Blickman Engineering has been the pioneer of nano brewing, and they've helped hundreds of successful breweries achieve their dreams. Starting with one-barrel systems way back in 2006, they now offer brew houses up to 15 barrels. They also have cellaring equipment, keg washers, grain mills, and much more, sized specifically for the nano brewer. Blickman Pro Brewing systems are competitively priced without sacrificing quality. When you're ready to go pro, be sure to reach out to them at ProSeries@BlickmanEngineering.com. Again, that's ProSeries@BlickmanEngineering.com. And I recently updated the payment system for BeerSmith to give more options to purchase and renew your BeerSmith desktop and web-based software. You can now purchase 2- and 3-year licenses for BeerSmith at a discount, and you can use Venmo and Square for non-subscription payments. I'll also be announcing a BeerSmith 2 to 3 upgrade program shortly to make it easier than ever to upgrade. Check out BeerSmith Brewing software at beersmith.com. I'd like to thank you for listening, and I hope you have a great brewing week.